Hello, folks. We are back with another video in our Intro to African History series, which is part of the larger channel, of course. And today we are continuing with some of the work we started last week on North Africa. Last week we spoke about the advent of Islam in North Africa, you know, the conquering of Egypt from the Byzantium Empire in the 7th century by the Arab armies coming from Western Asia, what we call typically the Middle East. We spoke about the conversion of the Maghreb, which is west of Egypt, right? Which dovetailed into our conversation about the Moors and the Almoravids and the Almohads. And I think that's where we ended. So today we are going to talk a little bit at what point does North Africa become Arabized, which is something that it's synonymous with today in large part. We're also going to talk about a couple of the Egyptian dynasties that came into power 10th century going forward, and so forth, right? So without further ado, and oh, by the way, you know, if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. I try to post as many videos on African history and other topics of interest to the Pan-African community as much as possible. So make sure to subscribe, share this video if that's sort of your thing. But without further ado, let's get right into the material here. Indeed. Let me share my screen. Bravo. And you'll see my pretty face at the end. All right. So although different armies, Muslim armies, mostly populated by Arabs, had come through, right, beginning in the 7th century, conquered Egypt that century and so forth, and spread as far as the Maghreb and so forth. The North Africa was not especially Arabized, right? It was not especially Arabized until the 900s, which is the 10th century, of course. And the group that is responsible for this is pictured here today. This is a modern picture, of course, but the culture of it all still persists. And this group is known as the Bedouin people, from the Arabic word Badawin, which means desert dwellers. And these folks moved gradually from Arabia into North Africa, right? Not all at once, but in again, like nomads do in small communities, bit by bit came in, right? Living in tents made from camel skin that they could easily dismantle and re-erect. So they were always on the move. So what that helps is when you're always on the move, it's easy to carry your culture with you far and wide, right? So part of the reason now, despite being Muslim, and remember, Muslim was very much tied to the culture of literacy early on. These guys were non-literate, they were nomadic. So some of the other Muslim communities would look down upon them, right? Because they're sort of the lesser, because of their literacy stature and so forth. And so they would be blamed for the destruction of the rural areas in the Maghreb. However, they are still widely responsible for the Arabization of North Africa and the spread of the Islamic faith, right? When we say Arabization, we're talking about both the language and the culture. So when you look at places like Egypt today and Tunisia and so forth, and you see a huge Arab presence, right? This is something that is a product of around that time, the 900s, i.e. the 10th century going forward. It wasn't always like that, right? Within a few decades of 1050, more than 250,000 Bedouins had moved from Egypt westward into the Maghreb. So, and as they did that, they also absorbed a large number of Berbers, And part of the reason too that they probably found resonance with the Berbers is because the Berbers also resented some of the same sort of authority that the literate Arab Muslims brought with them. We spoke about this a little bit last time. So there was also this solidarity between these groups, right, that permeated here. But the important thing here to remember is that the Bedouin, beginning in the 900s, spread from Arabia into Egypt, then right across into West Africa, and are largely responsible for the Arabization of the Maghreb and Egypt. It is during this time that the Maghreb and Egypt become largely Arabic speaking, right? Indeed. So as we saw last time, Egypt is taken over in the Islamic invasions of the 7th century, but it takes some time before we start to get any very prominent empires come in or dynasties come in to rule Egypt. And the first important one, right, is the Fatimid Caliphate, or what we call the Fatimid Dynasty, which came into power in 969. Came into power in 969, right? And this was a Shiite group, and you can tell it's Shiite. The name Fatimid suggests that. Remember, we've spoken about the difference between the Sunni and the Shia, but the Fatimid are the Shiite, sorry, are the hardliners who believe that the leadership of the Muslim faith should have been the successor of the leadership after Muhammad passed should have gone to Ali, who was the son-in-law of the Prophet, through Fatima, who was his daughter. So when you say Fatimid dynasty, that's a shout to Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. So you can tell these are the people who are genealogically aligned with the Prophet and the followers and their followers. So in 969 CE, they took over. They conquer Egypt, right? They conquer after having overthrown the previous rulers who were also Muslim at this point. They take over and enter into a period of prosperity. They rule for the next 200 years or so, and they usher in an era of great prosperity, right? Dams and canals were repaired, and the production of wheat, barley, cotton, things like that increased. The Delta region became a center of development for a huge textile industry and so forth. The caliphs, the leaders, minted their own gold coins, and the Fatimid dinar became a basic unit of international currency in the rising Swahili towns. So you think about this, right? You think about the Swahili towns, we're talking about modern day Kenya, Mozambique, and so forth. Those are the Swahili towns. And you still found the cities, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, and so forth. And you still found the Fatimid dinar over there, the currency that was being minted in Egypt. So this just shows the extent, not of the connectivity of the continent at the time, but also the impact that that Fatimid Egypt reached, right? So how were they so successful? Another thing that they also did was they would charge heavy customs duty on all imports and exports, right? And also, so that was part of it, but the large part of their money came from taxing the peasantry, right? There was a system called the IQTA, IQTA, which is sort of like sharecropping, and the peasants, known as the fellahin, would work on this, and they would be heavily taxed by the leadership, which is where they got all their a large part of their sustenance from, right? Indeed. So who was in the army? Who was in this army that conquered this region? First of all, initially, they'd come in and they'd conquered Egypt with a small but effective Berber army, right? This Fatimid Berbers. Eventually, these Berbers, now think about these are different ethnic groups, right? The Arabs, the Berbers, and so forth, but they're working together in this regard. After a while, the Berbers would come in, they got comfortable, right? Settled in the upper ranks, as the conquerors of Egypt. They grew prosperous and comfortable. So what happened at this point is very important, because they started bringing in the Mamluks, right? The Mamluks was a cavalry made up of free Berbers and soldiers from as far out as Turkey, who were more mercenaries. The word Mamluks, and we'll talk about them a little more later, but actually sort of means property, right? So these are soldiers of fortune. They are not, they're not soldiers with nationalistic ideals or anything like that. They're just small soldiers of fortune, but they come from as far out as Turkey, right? And they're blended in with some of the Berbers here. For the most part, the foot soldiers were mostly Black Sudanese slaves that had been imported from south of the Sahara. Indeed. So when we say Sudanese, we're not necessarily talking about the modern day of Sudan. We're talking about that era to the south of immediately to the south of North Africa, if you will. So for the next 200 years, they are very successful. The Fatimids are, and however, as you can tell with the system, that is where people get comfortable, and also the leadership gets comfortable, and also that is very much dependent on borderline oppressive taxes, maybe not even borderline, on just oppressive taxes. It can only last so long, right? So, for example, the government income from the tax farming soon declined as the leadership got more corrupt. The caliph, right, the dynasty was unable to pay for the upkeep of its army, right? And when you can't pay your army, but they have the military might to do so, they'll pillage and plunder. So they started pillaging and plundering the countryside, right? Then all this within the military itself, you start to see Mamluks, right, who had been brought out from Turkey, the Berbers within the army, as well as the Sudanese soldiers, started fighting each other, which all disrupts trade and so forth. And this seriously weakened the authority of Fatimid Egypt. Then something else is happening in the 1160s. What is it? It's the Crusades, right? So you see the Crusades are starting to happen around this time. I mean, have been happening around this time. In fact, this is about the era of the Third Crusade. The Christian Crusaders have been on the come up. They've already established the kingdoms of Antioch and Jerusalem, right? And Egypt is next for them. They are back to reclaim Egypt, okay? And they came so close. The Christian kingdoms came so close to conquering them. If it wasn't for the work or for the military genius of one man, and this man is who we'll talk about next, Salah al-Din. So as we were just explaining here, Salah al-Din, okay, as we were just explaining here, Egypt is now threatened by the Fatimid dynasty has sort of collapsed, is now being threatened by the Christian Crusades, which are spreading at this point. So after the death of the last Fatimid Caliph, and we'll talk about that shortly, after the death of the last Caliph of the Fatimid dynasty, Salah al-Din, pictured here, became the ruler of Egypt and founded the Ayyubid Dynasty, Now, Salah al-Din is different because he is not Shia like the Fatimid dynasty. He's actually Sunni Orthodox. So, and he's also ethnically Kurdish, right? So very different here. But he's able to restore some of the glitz and the glam that had been lost over the years of corrupt rule in the Fatimid dynasty. Is able to restore that, reestablishes Egypt as a prominent, especially Cairo, as an important center of Arabic and Islamic learning and culture, right? And one thing that he does, which sort of changes the game for better or for worse later on, was combining military recruitment with the form of with the reform in the system of taxation, through which the military was now overwhelmingly responsible for the taxation. And he again begins recruiting Mamluks from as far out as Turkey, right? Which is something that had stopped over the years. and this became very well armed with bows and arrows and swords and so forth. And again, they ran the tax farms, right? This is how they sustain themselves. So what about this deal with Saladin, man? What's the big deal with Saladin and the Crusades? So Richard the Lionheart, right? If you know, you know, this is a name you may come across when studying European history. This guy, Richard the Lionheart, is sort of on the forefront of the Crusades to retake Jerusalem, right? So at this point, sorry, Saladin has prevented the Christian Crusaders from taking Egypt. In fact, he does so well that he goes as far as reclaiming, right? Reclaiming Jerusalem, which had fallen to the Christian Crusades. Now the Christians are pushing back, right? So he's recaptured Jerusalem by 1187, right? And now they push back. The Christians push back. And there's a huge conflict, but this is where Saladin, right? So I keep saying Saladin because his name is Salah al-Din, but you might see it's spelled Saladin, just Saladin. So this is the same person, but this part is very interesting, right? And I'll quote here from a Time article that's talking about the relationship between Richard the Lionheart and my man here, Saladin. Richard found himself on the forefront of the Third Crusade in 1189 to retake Jerusalem, a city that had fallen 2 years before to an accomplished Muslim general named Salah ad-Din, or as he would be remembered by European chroniclers, Saladin. For a brief time, Saladin, an ethnic Kurd, ruled over much of the Levant, Mesopotamia, the holy cities of Arabia and Egypt. Lands whose wealth and civilization would have bewildered Richard and many of the gold-seeking crusaders. In short, the Third Crusade failed in seizing Jerusalem, though Richard's forces did score a small victory against Saladin at Arsuf in 1191. Sources from the time paint the rapport between Richard I and Saladin in high chivalric times, noting how Saladin dispatched his doctors to Richard when he heard the English was ill, and 2 horses when Richard's one proved lame. Saladin is remembered in Europe still as the noble chivalrous general from the East. But as more recent historians argue, both he and Richard were brutal warriors with little need or time for pleasantries that have gone on to burnish their legend for centuries, end quote. In fact, he was held in such high esteem in Christian Europe that there's this concept of virtuous pagans, right? And the idea of virtuous pagans is just people who maybe never heard. So the idea in the Christian faith, you have to give your life to Jesus for you to be even in the consideration for heaven, right? We're talking about hardliner, the core tenets of the religion here. However, the idea of the virtuous pagans is people who may never had the chance to hear about Jesus, who were never converted, but were just very, very good people who are often considered as virtuous pagans. So the church and the Christian scholars of the time had a list of people who were virtuous pagans, and among them are people like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, some of the other emperors who may have died before Christianity took hold. But among that list, you have Saladin, right? Despite the fact that, of course, as a Muslim, you knew very well about Christianity and so forth. But it's just interesting that in that number of mainly European men, you have Saladin in there included on that list, and that just shows how highly he was respected indeed. Anyway, but this Ayyubid Dynasty, for all its successes under Saladin, was not long lived. It only lasted maybe like 80 years, because by 1250, the Mamluks, right, who had been so empowered, took over power, took over control. Now Egypt would be ruled by a military aristocracy, the Mamluks, and they would rule it right up until 1517 here. So powerful military aristocracy. They continue to import more and more Mamluks. They go as far out as southern Russia, right? And you can see here, this is the general map here. Go out as far as southern Russia, right? And the green part here is all the territory that they claim. Egypt control under Mamluk rule spreads out to Syria, spreads out to Palestine, far and wide, right? Far and wide. You know, the Mamluks are coming from all sorts of places, and they continue to grow in power. They even defeat the Christians in the Fourth Crusade, as well as the Mongols, right? They defeat the Mongols as well, right? And further cemented Islam as Egypt as Islam's center. The backbone of the economy, as had been established in the earlier dynasties, remained the fellahin. Remember, the fellahin are the peasants, right, who were squeezed hard by the Mamluks, who held the Ikta. Again, this sort of pseudo sharecropping system. You know, so the way the fellahin would the land that they got was hereditary, but however, even though it was hereditary, it now belonged to the Mamluks, right? So it was hereditary for you to stay on the land, but you would still have to pay these taxes to the Mamluks who held the Ikta. And they pressed them, you know, they pressed them so hard that in the 14th century, it is estimated that there were 10,000 Mamluks in Egypt, ruling over 4 to 5 million Egyptians. 10,000, but that just shows their military might, right? That they were very, they had the community of millions under their thumb. Then eventually, as the 15th century came around, the system of linking taxation with military service collapsed. The Mamluks began to treat the Ikta as their own thing, right? It's no longer of the service to the nation. Individual Mamluks start to treat it as their own personal property, and this increase in corruption, you know, the public works ceased, canals became blocked, and you see this. Think about this when you think about politics today, right? When leaders of a country start to treat it, or the ruling powers start to treat it as their own personal property, and forego some of the things that even got them there, that made them successful early on, right? And it's the same thing that's happening here, that public works ceased, canals became blocked, and there was a general decline in agricultural productivity. And now this is combined with droughts at the time, famine, right? As well as locust infestation and so forth. Indeed, so ultimately, by 1500, the Mamluk army was so disorganized and hopelessly out of date. They had not kept up. They got so comfortable, and eventually, so by the beginning of the 16th century, the 1500s, they proved no match for the modernized armies, which would now define the next part of history. And we can talk about this in more detail next week. And this is the Ottoman Empire that will take over Egypt beginning in 1517. Right, indeed. So we will make a reference to it now, then we'll spell it out next week. But yes, so the Ottoman Empire begins with the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, right? The Constantinople in Turkey, the center of the Byzantium Empire. But once that's conquered, the city's name is changed to Istanbul, right? And it became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. They begin spreading and conquer Egypt in 1517, lost its independence and became a province within the Western Asian Empire, the Ottoman. However, the leader became a viceroy. The Ottoman Empire is very interesting because it wasn't a very heavy-handed empire where the provinces did not have much autonomy. It's just sort of under the control of of the Ottoman Empire, but you still have a lot of your own rights. One of the things that you see here is that the Mamluks, for example, were retained, right? Their role sort of shifted somewhat, but the Mamluks, were kept in some sort of power, right? As sort of pseudo nobles in this new community. So that's what I'm talking about the fact that the Ottomans would come in, but they would not entirely change everything. They did, but during the Ottoman Empire, Egypt's southern boundary was pushed into Nubia, right? Trade was revived, and importantly, the Portuguese were now starting to try assert themselves on East Africa. So when the Ottoman Empire was rebuilding, they re-seized the port of Massawa, which is in modern day Eritrea, to counter Portuguese expansion in the region. And again, like I said before, the Mamluks would soon come back into some control. They were not in power, but they were given some authority in that region. And we'll see how that plays out at the end, indeed. So that's Egypt under Ottoman rule beginning in 1517. Now, this is a fascinating one, right? Because here we've spoken about Egypt, man. Now we'll talk a little bit about the Maghreb, right? We can talk a little bit about the Maghreb as well, which is another very interesting angle here. So the Ottoman Empire by the 15th century, like we said, founded in 1453, essentially after the conquering of Constantinople. They're extending themselves by 1517. They're in Egypt. Spain and Portugal, in turn, are also trying to assert themselves, right, in that region. So to be said here for the 16th century and the rise of both the Spanish and the Portuguese, and in trying to claim territory, as well as the Ottoman Empire coming in after having conquered Constantinople in 1453 and now Egypt in 1517. Initially, it was the Spanish who were trying to make moves into the Maghreb, and initially they were successful in conquering a few important coastal towns, including Tripoli, and even enjoyed the support of some people. However, a lot of the other local people in the region preferred to ally with the Ottomans, so and so forth. So you get this sort of dynamic early on in the Maghreb, right? And eventually the Ottoman Empire is pretty successful in that region. They didn't end up dominating all the shipping lanes, but they did end up claiming cities such as Tripoli in modern day Libya, Tunis in modern day Tunisia, and Algiers in modern day Algeria. So they were able eventually, after some skirmishes with the Spanish, to conquer much of the territory in that region. The only country that sort of remained independent through all this is Morocco, right? And part of the reason why Morocco was able to endure this was because of the Saadis, right? The Saadis are these brotherhoods, right? These Muslim brotherhoods that were very, very skeptical, given into Sufism as a branch of Islam, which is a mystical expression of Islam, which stresses personal knowledge of God via techniques such as self-discipline, meditation, and physical deprivation, rather than the more legalistic works-based approach of Orthodox Sunnism. So these brotherhoods were able to come together and successfully resist both the Ottoman and the Spanish conquest. An incredible war as the century went on, as the Spanish sort of faded into the background and the Portuguese became more pronounced. There's an incredible conflict that happens here in the 1570s, which I kind of want to read. And I will quote from the book by Gilbert and Reynolds here. So the leader at the time, right, had died in 1574. So this is how it goes. When the Sultan died in 1574. His eldest son, Al-Mutawakkil, became Sultan. Many in the family, however, felt that his position should have gone to Al-Malik, the eldest of the family princes, who was highly respected both in Morocco and abroad. Well educated, he is reputed to have spoken Arabic, Spanish, Italian, and Armenian. Al-Malik fled to Algiers, then to Istanbul, from whence he gained fame fighting for the Ottoman army in Tunis. Right, so this guy is defected and is going to be to join the Ottoman empires. The Ottoman, seeing an opportunity for political success in Morocco, where military conquest had failed, provided Al-Malik with an army. Invading Fez in 1576, Al-Malik received considerable local support, right, a returning hero. Al-Mutawakkil was forced to flee to the Portuguese for protection. And now both the Ottoman and the Portuguese have been brought in. The Portuguese king, Don Sebastian, saw much the same opportunity as his Spanish counterpart. Outfitting an army filled out by large components of German and Italian mercenaries, he made preparations to invade Morocco with the pretext of returning the rightful Sultan to his throne. In so doing, he was seeking not only to expand Portuguese influence in Morocco, but also to stymie Ottoman power in the region. Clearly, politics in North Africa were becoming considerably more complex as outside states and empires vied for influence. So what happened here in this war in 1578? In 1578, Don Sebastian and Al-Mutawakkil invaded Morocco, despite correspondence from Al-Malik requesting that Don Sebastian not intervene in Moroccan politics. Right, so Al-Malik advanced with his army from Marrakesh and met the Portuguese force at Alcázar el Quibir. What ensued is known as the Battle of the Three Kings. In the battle, all three kings were killed, right? So both the Al-Malik, Al-Mutawakkil, and Don Sebastian all died in this battle. The forces of Al-Malik in the end carried the day, right? Some 14,000 European troops were taken captive. Many, particularly those whose families were too poor to ransom them, converted to Islam rather than face enslavement. So this is interesting here. The Portuguese defeat, this is very important. Listen to this. The Portuguese defeat in this battle toppled the home government, resulting in the Kingdom of Portugal passing control to King Philip of Spain. So these battles don't just have significance to the African continent, they shift global politics as well, because as a result of this battle, the king of the Kingdom of Portugal is then passed on to this is where King Philip takes over Portugal. So this is fascinating here. And in the aftermath of that, Al-Mansur comes in, whose image, popular depiction is over here, comes into power. Al-Mansur comes into power, and one of the things that he does is he expands the rule of Morocco and even goes as far as to conquer modern day, what was the Songhai Empire in its later days. At the time, the Songhai Empire had reached its heights in the 15th century, earlier in the 16th century, but was now on its way down. And Ahmed Al-Mansur is able to go out there with his army, right? With some of the Europeans who had converted to Islam now joined the army, and they were able to conquer the Songhai Empire with some ease. However, that experiment in empire was very short-lived. The conquest of Songhai proved to be a draw in resources, as many of the people continued fighting, right? Many of the local Soninke people of the Songhai Empire continued fighting. Then, of course, after Al-Mansur died in 1603, the enthusiasm for the empire just wasn't there anymore, right? So a lot of the military leaders, Moroccan military, just settled there as sort of chiefs, right? The armor sat down, and begin to identify more and more with the local people. A lot of them married into those families and so forth. So Morocco in different forms would endure from then on. In fact, there's one little tidbit here that is fascinating, which is to say, a leader known as Sidi Mohammed, who came into power in the 1760s. So this is long after this. Is important to the history of the United States. He was the first head of state to recognize the rebel North American colonies as a sovereign nation. So you ask, when the Americans, right, when the colonialists were trying to secede from the British Empire, who was the first national leader or head of state to acknowledge them? It was this Sidi Mohammed guy out of Morocco. So that's a very important bit of history as well, right there. All right, we have a couple more pages to touch on today. As we saw earlier, when the Islamic armies were spreading across North Africa, they tried to get into Nubia as well. Now, Nubia was a dogged Christian society going way back when, going back at least a few centuries at this point. And they had a strong military back in the day. So early attempts saw two battles between the Islamic armies and the Nubian armies at Dongola, both of which the Muslim armies lost, right? So they were not able to get into Nubia, which is the modern day Sudan, at the time that they were expanding across North Africa. However, in time, their influence spread by way of trade, right? And in time, they continue to, sort of playing the long game here, right? Playing the long game here. A lot of the Muslim and Arab populations end up settling in modern day Nubia through trade. Some of them even married into the community. Arab nomads spreading the religion right through the 15th century. And it is also at this point that the religion became Africanized in terms of personnel, right? A lot of the Black people of sub-Saharan Africa start to get involved in this as well. And part of what also begins to happen at this time, well, not begins to happen, but happens at a prominent level, is many of the Muslims who now live in these communities would raid the different communities around them of non-Muslims, right? Who were then carried off into enslavement. This is part of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Right? A lot of people were taken into Egypt and Western Asia that way. If you watch the videos I did on the transatlantic slave trade, we talk about this as well, because it is a very important trade that was happening as well, right? The numbers pale in comparison, the scale pales in comparison to the transatlantic slave trade, but this is a trade that was happening then as well. And in the picture here is you have the prominent castle of Makura, which in the 1300s was converted into a mosque, just to show that by the 14th century, Nubia had become very much Islamicized. In the 15th century, you get the rare non-Arab power that came into power, known as the Funj Sultanate, right? This happened at about the same time that the Ottoman conquest of Egypt was occurring. The Funj Sultanate, the Funj were cattle pastoralists and horsemen who had originated out of Upper Nubia, and but eventually they were able to take over. Their origins are a little bit obscure, but by 1600, initially they just took over. They were not Muslim, but by 1600 they had become Muslim, and they remained a ruling elite for a long time. So this is just worth mentioning as well, that even at the height of Islam, the Funj still came over and took over as pastoralists. A very rare occurrence here, but by 1600, even they were Muslims as well, even though they ruled sort of indirectly, living the local chieftainships and power. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about today is the Oromo. Now, if you watch the video that I did on the if you watch the video that I did on East Africa from the 10th century to the 600s, we spoke a lot about this. We spoke a lot about the events that sort of precede this, right? But I will just revisit this right now so that we can further contextualize this. Oh, sorry. Well, the 16th century, Christian Ethiopia, right, which had endured as well for a long time as a Christian nation, Christian kingdoms, with the Solomonic dynasties and so forth. They had been able to withstand Islamic invasions when that whole region had gone down. Now, but in 1529, the leadership of there was a sultanate, right, a Muslim community in that region known as the Sultanate of Adal. And again, I've spoken about this previously, but they were able to, they regrouped, and under the leadership of El Gran, right, the left-handed, who was the military leader of the time, they were able to attack the much larger Christian kingdom in 1529 and overcome them. Now, the Christian Ethiopia, noticing that they'd been defeated, they approached the Portuguese, right? Now, the Portuguese what would their interest be? Well, the Portuguese want to get more involved in the region, but they also have that Christian solidarity with Christian Ethiopia. So they decide to, and of course, they've been pushing against the Ottomans all this time in different spaces, as we've already seen. Now, this is on East Africa. The Portuguese come in and team up with the Ottoman, or with the Christian Ethiopia, and they're able to push back Adal, the Sultanate of Adal, and in 1543 they're able to reclaim. So 12, 13 years after after Ethiopia had fallen to the Muslims, the Christian kingdoms are able to come back into power. Things would never be the same from there on. This conflict between the Christian and the Muslims would leave very much the central authority of the kingdom very weakened, and such. So it would be for a long time. And in this gap, one group that sort of comes to prominence are the Oromo people, right? The Oromo people, formerly known as the Gala, were Cushitic speaking pastoralists, who came all the way from the border region of modern day Kenya and southwestern Ethiopia, right? Within more than just one generation, the Oromo coming in because of this conflict, right, had occupied the southern third of Ethiopia and were pushing towards the valley of Awash and plateau of Hara, right? So they were coming in, again, as sort of nomadic groups. They were not coming in as an organized kingdom. They were coming in gradual migration. They had no overall central authority. Like many pastoral peoples, they lived in a number of loosely organized extended family clans. So they kept coming in, but as they come in and they're finding this space, and they're not being very much challenged because the conflict has weakened the state. They're coming in, and their cattle herds are expanding and so forth. So they end up settling very well. But this whole time, the Christian kings of Ethiopia were paying no mind to the Oromo, right, from the south. They were concentrated on holding on to the northern part of the kingdom and opening up trade with the Ottoman Turks and so forth. Right, so indeed, so this is where we'll leave off here. Another thing, though, that is worth talking about is the fact that many captives from East Africa were being sold to Turkish traders on the Red Sea coast, and the removal of so many people from the southwest only further cleared the land for further expansion of the Oromo from the south. So yeah, so you know, the Christian kingdoms were involved in some dastardly trade as well. At this point, this is you know, this plays into the Indian Ocean trade via the Red Sea as well. Indeed. So, but the important takeaway from this slide is how the Oromo took advantage, right, of this conflict that had been initiated by the Christian Ethiopia and the Muslims in that region, and the lack of centralized authority there to come and assert themselves on this population. We will revisit Ethiopia. We'll revisit all these communities next week when we look at what would happen to them in the period immediately before the scramble for Africa. So we're talking about the late 18th century, right through to the 19th century. So with that, thank you so much for putting up with me today. You know, I hope you enjoyed this video, and join me next week when we conclude this North African mini series. For now, anyway, when we talk about Egypt, Morocco, and so forth, and Ethiopia and all those places just before the conquest, the European conquest of Africa, aka the scramble for Africa. Indeed. Thank you guys so much, and see you next week.